And at its heart, of course, is Moore's Law. And for decades now, I've been in the debate, is Moore's Law dead? And the answer is no.
So, Moore's Law, no. I don't know. I think the place to start here is to explain that. In my last video, I talked about how Moore's Law has changed definitions in order to fit the crime over the past few years. So, the original place where Moore's Law came from was an article in Electronics. It was volume 38, number 8, and April 18th, 1965. And the article was written by Gordon Moore, who was at that time was working for Fairchild. He wasn't working for Intel. They hadn't founded Intel yet. But he said, the complexity for minimum component cost has increased at a rate of roughly a factor of 2 per year. And then he said, see the graph, and that's the graph that he's referring to. And he says, certainly over the short term, this rate can be expected to continue, if not to increase. Over the longer term, the rate of increase is a bit more uncertain, although there is no reason to believe it will not remain nearly constant for at least 10 years, which means by 1975, the number of components per integrated circuit for a minimum cost will be 65,000. And later on, he revised this, but we'll talk about this in context. 1975, at the IEEE International Electron Devices meeting, Gordon Moore revised the forecast rate based on what had happened. He said, the semiconductor complexity would continue to double annually until 1980, after which it would decrease to a rate of doubling approximately every 2 years. So, but at that conference, he formulated the second law, which was the capital cost of a semiconductor fab also increases exponentially over time. So as you try to shrink things, your costs get higher and higher to do that, which that makes sense, right? How did they do? I mean, how well did they actually do? So how did they do? In 8085, the first microprocessor to be released during the time frame when they should have hit 65,000 only actually had 6,500 transistors, a full order of magnitude short of the goal of 65,000 by 1975. Intel's 8086 had 29,000 transistors in 1978. So even 3 years later, they still hadn't met the goal. They didn't actually exceed the goal until 1982, which was done by the 8286 processor. The 8186 only had 55,000. It was close, so close. But then the 8286 was launched that very same year, and it had 134 transistors. And so, quite a few years later did they actually make it, a total of 7 years after the goal. So it isn't an absolute. What about today? So what about today? The current announcement of the Intel 13th gen chips, let's look at the flagship, which is the 13900K. We don't know how many transistors are on it. I mean, Intel hasn't released that information yet. But we do know what they are for the 12900K. And the count of transistors on that flagship of the previous generation is 2.95 billion transistors. So, quite a few. And we can see that, Moore's Law has pretty much tacked all the way up to 2020 and it's been fairly close to doubling about once every 2 years. Now, so one thing we do need to talk about here is tick-tock. Once the dual-core CPUs came out, I think it was around 2006, Intel realized that they were going to have an issue trying to maintain Moore's Law. So what they came up with was a strategy called tick-tock, where on the tick cycle, they would improve the technology. So it was process and then optimization. So the process would change on the tick, and the optimization phase would occur on the TOC. So each generation release of the chip would do this. I'll improve the process, and then I'll improve the optimization, and then do the process again. So yeah, that basically slowed Moore's Law right down. Dennard scaling, I've talked about this before, was in 1974, Dennard observed that voltage and current should be proportional to the linear dimensions of a transistor. In other words, as a transistor shrank, so did the necessary voltage and current, and that was proportional to the area of the transistor. So to put this another way, as the size of the transistor shrinks, the voltage comes down, it's reduced, and the circuit can operate at higher frequencies at the same power draw. But Dennard had a slight problem. The Dennard's law ignored leakage current. It also didn't take into account startup current or threshold current, which later we'll find is a big deal. So how did that work? Well, right up until about the year 2000, yeah, it was kind of right on, but we started seeing a rise as we got through as the clock frequencies came up, we started seeing a rise in the breakdown of Dennard scaling. And it was around 2006, 2005, there was I think this was right around the time of what we thought might be the Pentium 5. This was right around the time when that was being developed, and we'll talk about that one. But you'll see this huge precipitous drop, and that's when Intel introduced multi-cores. So, yeah, and at that point, we were able to drop down the voltages because they reduced the clock speed. So let's talk about this would have been we don't really know if it was going to be called the P5. It never got into production. Officially within Intel, it was called the Tejas and the Jayhawk project. Tejas was the desktop product, and that was rumored to be able to now the Pentium 4 was at 4 gigahertz. So the Tejas project was going to take that clock frequency from 4 gigahertz as high as 7 gigahertz and perhaps maybe higher. So that was the idea behind that. And there's two pictures here of these would have been early production chips. These would have been the ones where they did evaluation. Jayhawk was a similar project, but it was Xeon based, and of course that would be meant for the server. Both of these were 90 nanometer designs. So, but the previous generation Pentium 4 had a number of pipeline stages of 30, which was incredible at the time when you think about it. And and the Pentium 4 had run into some issues with what are known as pipeline bubbles. That happens when you have cache misses. Well, what do you do when you have a cache miss? You have to clear out all of the pipelines and start building it up again, because what you have predicted is going to be false, and everything is loaded in the pipeline you got to throw away because that's not what you're going to do next. Tejas and Jayhawk project actually, now those two chips we think had the 50-stage pipeline in them. That's an incredibly deep pipeline. And as I mentioned in the Moore's Law, when you get that deep, you get all kinds of latency that can occur with pipelines that deep. Intel thought they had all that worked out. And internally, this is kind of funny, internally they nicknamed the project the Death Star processor. So, yeah, they ran into the heat and the power wall. And on May 7th, 2007, just as they were finishing up the final what they call the photographic image that would be going to the production of the chip, it was canceled because they weren't even sure they could cool the thing. So yeah, they didn't think they could cool it. So that's a problem. So they learned from that though, and they took what they learned from the Project Tejas, and they took some of that and they applied it to the dual core processor. And by going to dual cores, they could double the performance, but they could drop the clock frequency to do it because they had two cores that could work in parallel. So up until the 130 nanometer mark, as transistor density increased, power consumption had declined, just like Dennard scale had predicted. But once they got past 130 nanometers, power consumption and heat started to rapidly increase and led to the solution of multiple cores. There was that problem that killed Project Tejas and Project Jayhawk. So the transistor size is ultimately constrained by the limits of the physical world, and the time will come when there'll be no longer possible to place more transistors on the same size chip. Well, obviously they hit that. And we talked about last time the problems with adding cores. If you want to know more about that, see my last video on Amdahl's law. I'm not going to go back through that again here. I'll put a link, and then you can, if you want to go look at it, you can. So let's talk about the recent miniaturizations. So as of 2022, Samsung announced, I think it was back in June, the 3 nanometer chip. Apple Silicon's latest M2 uses TSMC's enhanced 5 nanometer process, and the Apple A16 Bionic uses TSMC's 4 nanometer process. Intel, on their 13th gen CPU, is using 3rd generation 10 nanometer process, but they have committed to doing 7 nanometer very soon. The original prediction was to have 7 nanometer in production by the end of 2022. I don't know if that's still going to happen, but during the innovation series in September of 2022, Intel announced their plan to get their roadmap to get to 18 angstroms in 4 years. IBM's Power 10 CPU uses 7 nanometer. They haven't announced an 11th generation of that power chip yet. AMD, of course, released their Ryzen 7000 series CPUs. Those are based on 5 nanometer with the I/O die, I think, is at 6. NVIDIA announced their 40 series GPUs, and those are at 4 nanometer. So that's kind of where things are as far as miniaturization are concerned today. So some think that Moore's Law is already dead. I mean, MIT's review published an article way back in 2016 saying Moore's Law is dead. The Tech Republic published an article on September the 19th, 2018, also declaring Moore's Law is dead. Samsung didn't declare it dead, but they have been manufacturing 3D chips for their SSDs. So apparently, I mean, I'm putting words in their mouth. They have never stood up and said this. So apparently they believe Moore's Law is dead because they're stacking. They're starting to stack. The crystal ball. So what do I think is going to happen here? The factors now around the ability to maintain Moore's Law are not just physics. There's other things that are coming into play. The first, and I have said this many times, the Van Neumann architecture, it's a bottleneck. What else could we do? We could do 3D stacking, which is what Samsung is doing. We could specialize the hardware, and that is occurring today. We're starting to see ASICs and FPGAs, like tensor cores and neural cores, and we're starting to see specialty chips being developed for, we're seeing cryptographic accelerators. We're seeing I/O accelerators, network accelerators. That you could just, those are things that are not new. Those were all done in the mainframe era where they had dedicated processors that ran along the information chain that actually took over processing of it on behalf of the CPU. So basically, if you were going to do an I/O to either the network or to the disk, the CPU would hand off to an I/O processor, and then it would go back to work. So yeah, and those would then occur in parallel. And they would come back with the data, and they would do either a DMA transfer, or they would do an interrupt to tell the processor, hey, I've got data for you. But we could also go to neural-like architectures, brain-like structures. In order to do that, they do not suffer from the same type of thing. We could go to fiber. We could go to photon-based CPUs. Intel is doing work in this area. Quantum computing, yeah, we could go to that. However, that's going to reverse decades worth of decentralization that has occurred. You know what I'm saying is that we don't have centralized mainframes. We have all kinds of machines now, mobile, desktop. Quantum, because of its need for extreme temperatures, 4 degrees above Kelvin, yeah, you can't. I don't think you're going to be able to put that in your house. Just saying. I don't think you could afford the chiller that you would need for that. Carbon nanotubes or thin film transistors. That's another possibility. I guess the real question is Moore's law dead? I would say yes in its original form. So that's all I had today. I hope you enjoyed this video on Moore's Law. And if you did, please like and subscribe, and hope to see you in the next video. Bye for now.